Bias in surveys. So sampling bias. A sampling bias occurs when the sampling frame does not reflect the characteristics of the population. Bias samples can result from problems with either the sampling technique or the data collection method. So an example, identify the bias in each of the following surveys and suggest how it could be avoided. A survey asked students at a high school football game whether a fund for extracurricular activities should be used to buy new equipment for the football team or instruments for the school band. So the problem here is that the sample only includes football fans, so it's not representative of the entire student body. Example number 2, an aid agency in a developing country wants to know what proportion of households have at least one personal computer. One of the agency staff members conducts a survey by calling households randomly selected from the telephone directory. So the key here is understanding that this is a developing country and that they are calling households. So the problem is that you're sampling only those households with a telephone. A non-response bias. This occurs when a particular group are underrepresented in a survey because they choose not to participate. Thus, non-response bias is a form of sampling bias. What bias could affect these results? A science class asks every fifth student entering the cafeteria to answer a survey on environmental issues. Less than half agree to complete the questionnaire. So the problem is that students who chose not to participate are likely to be those less interested in environmental issues. As a result, this sample may not be representative of all the students at the school. And as a result, the completed questionnaires show that a high proportion of the respondents are concerned about the environment and well informed about environmental issues. Measurement bias. A measurement bias occurs when the data collection method consistently either under or over estimates a characteristic of the population. While random errors tend to cancel out, a consistent measurement error will skew the results of the survey. Often measurement bias results from a data collection process that affects the variable it is measuring. So let's identify the bias in each of the following surveys and suggest how it could be avoided. A highway engineer suggests that an economical way to survey traffic speeds on an expressway would be to have the police officers who patrol the highway record the speed of the traffic around them every half hour. So the problem here is that people tend to slow down once they see a police car. So a way to fix this perhaps would be to use unmarked cars and maybe some hidden speed sensors, and this would give more accurate results. Example number 2, as part of a survey of the greatest hits of all time, a radio station asks its listeners, which was the best song by the Beatles? Help, Nowhere Man, In My Life, or another? The issue here is we're looking at the greatest hits of all time, not just the Beatles, and it's subjective whether or not the Beatles would actually belong on that list. So a better question would be to simply ask a general question of what do you think the greatest hits of all time should include? And I would agree that yes, you're going to get some songs from the Beatles. Last scenario, a poll by a tabloid newspaper includes the question, do you favor the proposed bylaw in which the government will dictate whether you have the right to smoke in a restaurant? So this is an example of a loaded question. So by suggesting that the government will infringe on the respondent's rights. So while the question in its essence is valid, the problem is how the words are skewed in one direction. So be careful of loaded questions. Response bias. A response bias occurs when participants in a survey deliberately give false or misleading answers. The respondents might want to influence the result unduly, or they may simply be afraid or embarrassed to answer sensitive questions honestly. How could a teacher eliminate this type of bias? A teacher has just explained a particularly difficult concept to her class and wants to check that all the students have grasped the concept. She realizes that if she asks those who did not understand to put up their hands, these students may be too embarrassed to admit that they could not follow the lesson. So the teacher could possibly say, this material was very difficult. Does anybody want me to go over it again? This is a less embarrassing and an easier way for students to engage in getting further information. So some of the key concepts: sampling, measurement, response, and non-response bias can all invalidate the results of a survey. Intentional bias can be used to manipulate statistics in favor of a certain point of view. Unintentional bias can be introduced if the sampling and data collection methods are not chosen carefully. And leading and loaded questions contain language that can influence the respondent's answers. Thanks for listening.